Hi, this is Irma McNeil again. Tonight I wanted to start my first series of what happens to a family when they find out some bad news. They get that call from the school, and usually that call is not a good call, unfortunately. But on, uh, I'll start out by saying I delivered my last two children, two boys, 2 years apart, and uh, very healthy boys. One was, this was my third one, so he was um, 8.5 pounds, and the fourth one was 9 pounds, 22 inches long. And this is after having two children earlier, 10 years earlier. So they were exactly 10 years apart. Well, these two, while in elementary school, before they even attended school in the morning, I would lay my hand on each one of them head and I would pray over them before they went to school. Um, One day, my youngest one started complaining about his stomach hurting and his head hurting. No, it was his head first. He was complaining that his head was hurting across the forehead. And I would check him for a temperature, but he wasn't hot and he didn't have a temperature. And he would come in and he would lie down, and that was unusual for him. So I did make an appointment for him to go to the doctor to see what was wrong. Um, the doctor said since he was dark under the eyes and he was hurting across the forehead, it had to do with sinus, so it probably was a sinus infection, and gave him some medicine for a sinus infection. Um, Later on, he started complaining about his stomach hurting. He was, "Oh, mama, my stomach hurt. My stomach hurts." And then he goes, "It stopped." And I was like, "What is this?" So I went to the doctor again to get a referral, and I got a referral for a GI doctor. Um, I was teaching for our tech college here in town, and I received a call from his school. That was that call. They told me that our son, his name Sean, Sean was sick, and they thought he had a stomach virus, and I should come and pick him up. And um, so I called my husband. I just missed my class. I called my husband, and I told him, I got a call from the school today. They're saying that Sean is sick. He has a stomach virus. He was doing well earlier when I dropped him off to school. Even before then, he was doing very well. That morning, he had a very good appetite. He ate breakfast. His dad would take his breakfast order at night, and he would get up in the morning and fix his breakfast. So he ate a good breakfast, and I dropped he and his brother off to school. Sean was in second grade. Simeon was in fourth grade. So I dropped them off to school, and I drove down the street to my class to teach for the tech college. Um, so after I got that call, I dismissed my class. I called my husband. I told him that I was going to the school. When I got to the school, I saw an ambulance, and I thought, oh, they're using an ambulance today for show and tell. So, and the younger kids were getting out of class because it was 12 o'clock. And it was lunchtime, so there was a lot of hustle and bustle going on. The teachers were outside, and I thought, wow, okay, they're doing show and tell. The little ones are being dismissed. There's a lot of hustle and bustle. When I got out to the car, the principal and the teacher, one of the teachers who happens to have been his wife, came to me and said, um, "After we called you, um, um, your son passed out." And I was like, "What? He passed out?" And when I said that, I saw the gurney coming out of the building with my son on it. And I can't tell you exactly what I felt because I didn't expect that the ambulance was there for him. They told me that they were gonna put him on an ambulance inside the ambulance, and they had to work on him before they took him to the hospital. The, um, the teacher, who was the principal's wife, she got in my car, she said, "Let me drive behind the ambulance." I was like, "No, you can't drive behind the ambulance. That's my child in the ambulance. I'm gonna have to drive." And then it started raining. We were still at the school waiting for the ambulance for the EMTs to finish working on him. I got out of my car and I went up to the ambulance and I said, "What is going on? Why we're not moving?" And they said, "We're still working on him. We'll be ready to go in a minute." So I got back in my car and they took off and I was on their tail. I put my flashers on, I put my seatbelt on, and I drove very closely behind the ambulance. I didn't want a car to get between us. I didn't want them to get far ahead of me, but I also kept in mind about being careful. But when the ambulance stopped, I stopped, and I ran into the hospital behind the uh, the gurney that my son was on. Um, they were saying something about you're not supposed to go in that way. I totally dismissed anything that anyone was saying because my child was on that gurney. So I ran behind them and um, they got to a point where they said I could not go in, that I needed to wait in the waiting room. When I got in the waiting room, I called my husband again to let him know that we were at the hospital and that Sean was very sick and he had passed out at school. I didn't know it, but my husband was at lunch. It was Professional Administrators Day, um, something like that, or Boss's Day, and he had taken a group of people out to lunch. And he told me later that he jumped up from the table and he ran to the vehicle to come to the hospital where I was, and he told them that they would have to find another way back to work, which they were about 30 miles from work, but they found a way. Um, when they did come out from with my son from behind closed doors at the hospital, they said, "Your son is very sick, and um, we have made um, plans for him to go to another hospital because we do not have a pediatric ICU here at this hospital." The other hospital was in another state, in another city, in another state. So um, they already had made arrangements, and he needed to have been flown there. But the weather was, by now, it was storming because it had already started raining before we left to school. Um, when by that time, my husband arrived at the hospital and I shared the news with him. We were very, very upset, scared, just a whole array of emotions that we never felt before because we'd never been in that predicament before. Um, they got the ambulance ready and they told us not to try to keep up with them because they drive really fast. And the trip that they were going to be making was an hour and a half away. So we got in our car. We actually started out before them. We we knew where that hospital was, so we started out before them. Um, we were praying. My husband was trying to drive. He he got a headache on the way. He was holding his chest. because this news was just a lot. They told us when they told us our son was bleeding on the brain, and he was bleeding on the brain a lot, and he was very, very sick. That's all the information we had, but that was way too much. It was just too much um, for us to handle, but we did the best that we could. We drove and drove and drove. The only reason the ambulance passed us was because we had to stop at a convenience store to get some um, Tylenol for my husband. So it was really a trip. Um, the school, I called some people and asked them to, who started calling people to ask them to pray because he was in a Christian school. By then, I started getting calls in the car, and one elderly lady called and said, "I heard that he was bleeding on the brain, so I have a scripture here for bleeding in the Bible." She said, "Quote this scripture while you all are driving there." When we arrived at the hospital, an hour and a half away in another city, in another state, um, they rushed him in, and there had to be about 20 people in that ICU, in that emergency room. Um, they got him on the table, and they were like, "How old is he?" I said, "He is 8 years old." They said, "Ah, he's pretty big for 8. How many pounds does he weigh?" I said, "He weighs 99 pounds." And they were like, "Give him medicine according to his weight and not his age." And they were like, "Give him this, give him that." The EMTs were like, "We gave him that on the way. Well, give him this and give him that." And I just stayed in there. I said, um, "Just give me a place to stand so I could touch my son and pray for him." My husband was out with the nurses. By now, he was just too weak to even stand. I looked out of the room, and there were two people holding him up. They actually had to sit him down in a wheelchair. This was very traumatic for us. By that time, a doctor came in, and she said, "I need you to come out for a minute." And I came out, and she said, "I need you to sign these papers. I'm going to have to go in, and I'm going to have to drill um, two holes in the top of his skull to relieve the pressure that is in his skull, on the pressure that was on his brain." And um, I signed the papers, and she ran in there to do the procedure. And as she was running, she turned around and looked at me, and she said, "It might not work," meaning that he might die during that process. So she drilled the holes in his skull um, to relieve the pressure off his brain, and it did work. And after then, they said, "Now we're gonna have to do a lot of X-rays and all kinds of tests to figure out what is going on with him." So they started all the tests, and we had arrived there, I guess, about 3 o'clock. About 10 o'clock that night, we were informed of the results of everything that they had done that day. And the results were that our son had a very large mass on his brain. It was very large, and it was very deep. And that was, again, about 10 o'clock that night. So that was the information that we had to go to sleep with. which we were in a hospital um, where the school, we were in Florida. We're from Georgia, so we were transported from Georgia to Florida. And the University of Florida is in Gainesville, Florida, and they had graduation that weekend. Um, that that week they had graduation ceremonies and a lot going on. There was no hotels available for us to get, and there were so many people being flown into the hospital and so many children because we were by then where they had gotten us a room on the 10th floor in pediatric ICU, PICU, and we had to sleep wherever we could in the lobby or in the Ronald McDonald room. My family, it was still storming. It was storming in Florida as well. And my family drove up from Central Florida. My mom, who was in her late 80s, my mom drove up with my sisters, with my sister, my mom, and actually two sisters. And in that stormy weather, they had to be there with me. They said they had to be there, and they were there. Um, so that was the information that we got. They told us that we would see the surgeon first thing the next morning, and we would go from there. So we started out that day in Georgia, and we got some really bad news, and we ended up that day in a city in Florida in another hospital. So two hospitals, two cities in two different states in the same day, and finding out some really bad news from that call that we received. So um, this is the start of the journey that I would like for you to take with me so that I can let you know what happened with us and the outcome of everything. Thank you so much for listening. And I will see you on the next session. All right. Thank you. Good night. I've got to figure out how to end it. I always have problems with this. I've got to get better. Mm-mm, 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 mm-mm. Not live anymore.